3 days after my daughter, my son-in-law, and my granddaughter moved into the home I built with my own two hands, I heard her telling the little girl that grandpas who ask questions are grandpas who don't get invited back. That night I asked my daughter gently not to teach my granddaughter to shut people out like that. She looked at me and said, "Maybe you should mind your business in a house you don't even live in anymore." My son-in-law stood up from the couch and said, "Apologize to my wife, or find somewhere else to sleep tonight." He'd forgotten whose name was on the deed. Welcome back, everybody. Before we start, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them. And a quick note before we begin. Some details in this story have been adjusted to protect the people in it. Everything that matters in it is true. My name is Walter Coben. I'm 66 years old, a retired machinist, and I've owned a two-story brick house on Larkspur Court, outside of Dayton, Ohio, for the last 28 years. My wife, Marion, and I bought it the year our daughter Hannah turned 6, back when the maple tree in the side yard was thin enough that I could wrap both hands around the trunk. Now it takes 2 grown men to do that, and every fall it drops leaves onto the whole block. Not just our lawn. Marion passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. The kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already made itself at home. People tell me grief gets smaller with time. What I've found is that it doesn't get smaller. You get bigger around it, the way a tree grows around a fence post that never moved. Some mornings I still make 2 cups of coffee before I remember. Some nights I still reach for her side of the bed. Her reading glasses are still on the nightstand, folded the way she always left them. I haven't moved them. I don't intend to. For most of those 6 years, it was just me in the house and the sound of the furnace clicking on in the mornings. I'm not going to pretend that kind of quiet is easy. But I made peace with it the way you make peace with anything that isn't going to change just because you want it to. Then, 16 months ago, my daughter Hannah called me on a Sunday evening. She was 34 then, a receptionist at a dental office, married to a man named Grant who did something in insurance sales that never quite paid what he said it would. They had a little girl, Sadie, who'd just turned 5. Hannah told me they'd fallen behind a car that needed a transmission, a landlord who'd raised the rent without warning, credit cards that had crept up past what either of them wanted to say out loud. She asked if they could stay with me for a few months, just until they got their footing back. I said yes before she finished the sentence. If I'm honest with myself, it wasn't really for Hannah, it was for Sadie. That little girl walked through my front door 16 months ago, holding a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and something in my chest that had been quiet for 6 years woke back up. The first few months were good. Better than good. Sadie would come find me in the garage on Saturday mornings while I was working on something, a birdhouse, a wobbly chair leg, whatever needed fixing that week, and she'd sit on the workbench stool and narrate everything I did like she was reporting the news. Grandpa Walt is turning the screw. Grandpa Walt is being very careful. I taught her the names of tools. She taught me the names of every dinosaur that ever existed, most of which I promptly forgot and had to ask her to repeat. Grant worked long hours and mostly kept to himself in the evenings, which was fine by me. Hannah seemed tired but grateful. For a while, the house felt less like a place I was waiting out my years in, and more like a home again. It was around the 5th month that I started noticing something in Sadie I didn't recognize. Small things, the kind you could talk yourself out of if you wanted to. She stopped finishing sentences when Hannah was in the room. She'd start to tell me something about a friend at preschool, about a picture she'd drawn, and then catch herself, glance toward the doorway, and go quiet. Once, she told me she'd broken a lamp in the living room by accident, and when I asked if she'd told her mom, she looked at me with an expression far too careful for a 5-year-old and said, "You're not supposed to tell on people you love. That makes them stop loving you back." I asked her where she'd heard that. She just shrugged and picked up her crayons. I didn't say anything to Hannah that first time. I told myself I was overthinking it, that grief makes a man see shadows where there aren't any. But 3 weeks later, I was walking past Sadie's door on my way to bed, and I heard Hannah's voice through the gap, low and patient in the way you'd explain something important. If Grandpa asks who spilled the juice, you don't have to say it was you. You just say you don't remember. It's not lying, sweetheart. It's just not everybody's business. I stood in the hallway with my hand flat against the wall and felt something settle in my stomach like a stone dropping into still water. The next evening, after Sadie was in bed, I found Hannah in the kitchen and asked her, as gently as I knew how, not to teach her daughter to dodge the truth like that. I told her it wasn't my place to lecture her on parenting, but that a child who learns to hide small things learns to hide bigger things later, and I'd rather Sadie grow up believing honesty was safe in this house. Hannah's face went sharp in a way I hadn't seen since she was a teenager slamming doors. "Maybe you should mind your business in a house you don't even live in anymore," she said. I told her that was a strange thing to say, seeing as my name was the only one on the mortgage. That's when Grant came in from the living room, arms crossed, and said the words that would sit in my chest for the rest of that year. "Apologize to my wife, Walter, or find somewhere else to sleep tonight." I looked at him for a long moment. He was 36 years old, standing in my kitchen, telling me to apologize or leave my own house. I didn't say anything back that night. I went to my room, sat in the chair by the window, and thought about Marion, and what she would have said, and how she always used to tell me that I was most dangerous when I went quiet instead of loud. By the second week of that month, Hannah had stopped arguing with me altogether. I made the mistake, early on, of thinking that meant things were improving. I understand now I was wrong. What she replaced the arguments with was quieter and far more effective. It started with breakfast. For over a year, mornings in that house had followed an easy rhythm. Sadie would come downstairs, find me at the table with my coffee, and climb into the chair across from me to tell me about whatever dream she'd had, or whatever question was currently occupying her 5-year-old mind. Those mornings were the best part of my day, plainly and simply. The first time Hannah redirected her, I told myself it was nothing. She came into the kitchen, saw Sadie across from me, and said sweetly, "Come eat with Mommy in the living room, baby. I put your show on." Sadie slid off the chair without a word and followed her out. The second time, I noticed. The third time, I understood. After that, the pattern held with a consistency that told me it wasn't accidental. Whenever Sadie drifted toward me, Hannah found a reason to pull her the other direction, a snack in another room, an errand that suddenly needed doing, a show that simply couldn't wait. Each moment looked innocent enough by itself. Together, they built a wall, brick by brick, between me and the one person in that house I still had left to love without complication. One evening, Sadie paused in the hallway on her way to find me. Her face lit up with something she wanted to show me, and Hannah caught her by the shoulder. "Grandpa's resting, sweetie. Don't bother him." Sadie looked down the hall toward my room, and I watched the light in her face dim, the way a bulb dims right before it flickers out. "But I wanted to show him my picture," she said. "You can show him tomorrow." I was standing just around the corner, out of sight, holding a book I hadn't meant to still be carrying. I listened to her small footsteps go the other direction, and I felt something in my chest pull tight, the way a rope pulls tight around something it was never meant to bind. Grant, for his part, stayed carefully out of it. He didn't participate, but he didn't stop it, either. He moved through those evenings with his eyes averted, a man who had made peace with not looking too closely at things that might require him to take a side. Once, Sadie ran past him calling my name, and he put a hand on her shoulder and said, mild as anything, "Hey, Mom's looking for you, bug." She turned without protest. He didn't look at me. I stopped trying to intercept those moments after a while. Not because I'd given up on Sadie, I want to be clear about that, but because I'd figured out, the way a man who spent 31 years running a machine shop figures things out, that every time I pushed back visibly, Hannah tightened the mechanism one more notch. So, I did what I've always done when a problem needed studying instead of shouting at. I pulled back. I watched. I waited. What I did instead was start writing things down. I kept an old spiral notebook in the drawer of my nightstand, the kind I used to jot down parts numbers and shift notes for 30 years at the shop. I started using it differently. Every night before bed, I'd sit at the kitchen table and write down what had happened that day, the date, the words as close to exact as I could remember them, the small redirections, the small dismissals, Hannah telling Sadie she needed a bath right as she'd started telling me about her day, Hannah saying Grandpa needed quiet whenever Sadie appeared in my doorway. Small things. The kind of thing a person could wave off as nothing, one at a time. But I ran a machine shop for 3 decades. I know that small tolerances, ignored long enough, are how big failures happen. A pattern isn't nothing. A pattern is a blueprint. And a blueprint, properly documented, is evidence. Marion used to say, I was at my most dangerous when I got quiet and started taking notes. She was right about most things. There's a kind of mercy that shows up in hard seasons if you're patient enough to let it. Mine came at the end of that same month, in the form of a phone call from Sadie's preschool teacher, a woman named Miss Okafor who'd had Sadie in her class since September. She asked if I could come in for a few minutes, said it wasn't urgent, just something she wanted to mention. I sat across from her in a chair built for someone half my size, surrounded by construction paper suns and lopsided crayon houses pinned to a corkboard, and she told me, carefully, that Sadie had been quieter lately, that she'd started covering her mouth when she laughed too loud, that she'd mentioned once, offhand, that her mommy said grown-ups who tell on people don't get to come to birthday parties. Miss Okafor said it the way careful people say hard things, not accusing anyone, just laying out what she'd noticed. Then she said, "She's a wonderful little girl, Mr. Coben. Still is. I just wanted you to know that." I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long while after that, watching kids I couldn't quite make out, shrieking with laughter on the playground beyond the fence, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was no longer the only person paying attention to what was happening in that house. If you've been with me this far, you've walked through 5 months of mornings I didn't get to have with my granddaughter. Evenings I sat alone in my own living room while I heard her laughing one floor above me, close enough to hear, too far to reach. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a 1 or a 2 in the comments. 1 if you think Hannah had already crossed every line there was. 2 if you think she wasn't finished yet. Most people guess wrong. I came home from my neighbor Otis's place on a Sunday evening at the end of that month to find the living room holding its breath the way a room does right before something bad gets said out loud. Otis Reyes had lived 2 doors down for 15 years, retired from the county road crew, and we'd spent that particular afternoon the way we usually did: 2 games of checkers, 1 long argument about the high school football team, more coffee than either of us needed. I'd driven home feeling something close to steady. That feeling didn't survive walking through my own front door. Grant was standing in the middle of the living room, not sitting, not moving, arms crossed, the posture of a man who's been told something and has been waiting for you to get home so he can repeat it at you. On the coffee table, arranged in a way that seemed deliberately visible, sat the broken pieces of Marion's music box. It had sat on that shelf for 22 years. She'd bought it on our honeymoon in a little shop outside Charleston, a carved wooden box that played a slow, tinny version of a song neither of us could ever name, and I hadn't moved it once in 2 decades. The hinge was snapped clean off. The wood was split down one side in a way that didn't match a fall. I know what a fall looks like. I spent 30 years around machines that fell apart in predictable ways. "Dad," Grant said, his voice tight, "did you knock Marion's box off the shelf this morning?" I looked at the pieces on the table. I looked at my son-in-law. I told him plainly that I'd been at Otis's since noon, that the box had been sitting exactly where it always sat when I left the house. Hannah stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel with slow, deliberate movements, and said, in a voice that managed to sound almost sympathetic, "It was fine this morning, Dad. I walked past it around 8. It was fine." I told her, calm as I could manage, that I hadn't touched it, that I hadn't touched it in years, that I had no reason on God's earth to break my dead wife's music box. Something passed between Hannah and Grant then, quick and wordless, the kind of communication 2 people share when they've already decided what story they're going to believe. Grant's jaw loosened into something that wasn't quite regret. "Dad, if it was an accident." "It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't me," I said. He looked at the table, looked at Hannah, and said, with the particular cowardice of a man who's learned that picking a side is easier than investigating a truth, "Okay, we'll get it fixed. Just be careful with Mom's things. All right?" Hannah nodded gravely, like this was a reasonable end to a reasonable disagreement, folded her dish towel, and went back to the kitchen. I stood there for a long moment, looking at what was left of Marion's music box sitting on the coffee table in my living room, in my house, the box she'd carried home in her lap on the drive back from Charleston because she didn't trust it to the trunk. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and made myself think instead of feel, which is a skill you either learn or you don't, and I learned it a long time ago running a shop floor. Grant had installed a small security camera above the front door back in the spring, after somebody had lifted 2 packages off the porch. It covered the front hallway and a good part of the living room. Everybody had forgotten it was even there. I hadn't. I didn't go check that footage that night. Not the next day either. I've never been a man who moves before. He knows exactly what he's moving toward. You don't pull a support beam until you know what's going in its place. But I knew, standing there looking at those broken pieces, that I was going to act. The only question left was when, and how, and in what order. And I've learned in 66 years that the answer to those questions is almost never as soon as you'd like it to be. Marion's tomato plants were coming in heavy that same week. the way they always did in the back corner of the yard she'd claimed for herself years ago. 5 plants she babied every spring, no matter how hard the winter had been. I was out there on a Tuesday morning with the hose running when my phone rang. Cliff Doyle. We'd worked the same shop floor for 19 years before he retired, and he never called before noon, so I felt my shoulders go tight before I even answered. "You seen what Hannah put up on Facebook?" he asked, and I told him I didn't touch Facebook, hadn't in years. "That's why I'm calling," he said. "I want you to hear it before you say anything." He read it to me slow, the hesitation of a decent man doing something he didn't want to do but felt he had to. Something about ungrateful old men who think ownership means control, about praying for peace in her own home, about how some people's time of being in charge just needs to end. 40-some likes. A string of comments from people who used to know me, asking if she was all right, telling her it gets better. Her profile wide open for anyone to read. I stood there with the hose running over the tomato plants and told Cliff thank you for telling me, and meant it, even though what was moving through my chest right then wasn't steady at all. He asked if I wanted him to say something back to her. I told him no, firmly. If I responded, or had somebody respond for me, it turned into a public fight. And a public fight was exactly what she wanted, vague enough that nothing in it could be pinned down, specific enough that anybody reading it would fill in the blanks with me as the villain. The best thing I could do was nothing at all, at least not in that particular arena. That evening, after Grant and Hannah had taken Sadie out for pizza, I sat at my kitchen table and made a call I'd been turning over in my mind for days. Ed Palmer had been 2 years ahead of me in trade school, gone into property law instead of machining, and we'd kept up loosely over 4 decades through mutual friends and the occasional Christmas card. I told him I had a situation, property-related, and needed the name of somebody who handled residential occupancy disputes in Ohio. There was a pause on the line, and then he said he actually handled some of that himself these days, and could I come in Thursday at 2? I told him Thursday at 2 would be fine. I hung up, wrote the appointment in my notebook under that day's date, and made myself a cup of the chamomile tea Marion used to brew on nights when her mind wouldn't slow down. I sat with it at the table until the house went quiet around me. The tomato plants were still out there in the dark, holding on the way they always did. By the following week, I'd started to understand something about how Hannah operated that I hadn't fully seen before. She never raised her voice anymore. She didn't need to. What she'd built instead was a slow, careful reorganization of the whole household, in which I became less and less necessary to my own life, meals planned around when I wasn't in the kitchen, errands run, so Sadie was conveniently out of the house during the hours she and I used to spend together. Small decisions made and announced after the fact, instead of discussed beforehand, as though I were a guest being informed of house rules rather than the man whose name was on the deed. I went and saw Ed Palmer that Thursday, in an office on the second floor of a building downtown that smelled like coffee and old carpet. I laid it out for him plainly, the 16 months, the notebook full of dates and small cruelties, the music box, the Facebook post, everything I'd observed and everything I suspected. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. And when I finished, he set his pen down and said, "You've thought this through." I told him I was a machinist for 31 years. I don't start a job until I know exactly what the finished piece is supposed to look like. I told him what I wanted to build for Sadie, not for Hannah, not to punish anybody, but for my granddaughter, specifically a fund she couldn't be pressured out of, structured so nobody could ever tell her what she owed anybody for it. Ed explained the mechanics of an irrevocable trust the way a good lawyer should, plainly, without softening the permanence of it. Once the assets went in, they were locked in place. No changing my mind later, no matter what happened with Hannah, no matter what happened with me. He asked if I was certain. I thought about Sadie in the garage on those Saturday mornings, narrating my screwdriver like it was the evening news, and I told him I was certain. He nodded once, the way a foreman nods when a part comes off the line exactly to spec, and said, "Then let's build it properly." We spent most of that afternoon working through it, an education fund that would carry her from kindergarten through whatever she chose to study after, a medical provision available immediately if she ever needed it, and a final piece released to her at 25, structured to require she present some plan for it rather than simply hand it over. That last part had been Marion's kind of thinking, before it was mine. She always said money handed over without any expectation attached, just produces people without direction. Ed wrote it down and didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said Marion sounded like she'd been a very practical woman. She was, I told him, and the kindest person I ever knew. Those two things were never in conflict, not in her. 2 weeks later, I sat at my own kitchen table with the finished documents in front of me, all 12 pages of them, reviewed by Ed, reviewed twice by the bank's trust officer, everything in order, needing nothing but my signature. I thought about Hannah as a girl, 6 years old, riding on my shoulders down to the corner store for ice cream, the way she used to fall asleep in the car every single time, no matter how short the drive. I thought about the woman standing in my kitchen 16 months later telling me to mind my business in my own house. I signed my name the way I sign everything that matters, slow and legible. Then I looked at the photograph of Mary and I keep on the windowsill above the sink, the one from our honeymoon, both of us squinting into the sun outside that little shop in Charleston, and I told her quietly that I was doing what I could, and the rest was up to whoever came after us. The documents were in Ed's hands by Friday morning. That same evening, I sat in the living room with a book I wasn't really reading while Grant watched a ball game across from me with the sound turned low. Upstairs, I could hear Sadie's feet on the floor, the muffled sound of whatever cartoon she'd talked her way into watching before bed. 10 minutes later, footsteps on the stairs, and there she was in the doorway in her pajamas, the ones with cartoon foxes on them that she refused to give up even though they'd gotten too short in the leg. She crossed the room straight to my chair, the way she always used to before things changed, and said, "Good night, Grandpa Walt." I put my hand on the top of her head, her hair still damp from the bath, and told her good night. Sleep well. She leaned into my arm for a few seconds. I counted them, the way you count things you want to remember, and then straightened up and told me, with tremendous seriousness, that she was going to dream about a stegosaurus that could talk. I told her that sounded like an excellent dream to have. She grinned, wide and unguarded, and padded back up the stairs. My eyes went warm in a way I had to sit with for a minute before I trusted myself to keep reading. Later that same evening, Grant set his phone down and said, without turning his head from the television, "You know, Dad, if you'd just apologize to Hannah, all this could go back to normal." I asked him, quiet, not cold, what exactly would go back to normal. He didn't have an answer for that. He changed the channel, then changed it back, and I told him good night and went to my room, the way I'd been doing for months. I sat at my desk and read back through the notebook from the first entry to the last. Every date, every small cruelty, every carefully noted moment, right up through the entry from that afternoon, trust documents signed and sealed. I closed the notebook, pressed my hand flat against the cover, and lay down in the dark knowing that in the morning I'd make one phone call. At 7 the next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and called Ed. 2 words. Today. Today. He told me he'd already drafted the notice, that his assistant would have a locksmith at the house by 10:30. At 8:30, when the house started stirring upstairs, I did something I hadn't done in months. I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Hannah came down first, stopped in the doorway when she saw me there. Did that quick calculation people do when something's shifted outside their expectations. Then recovered and went to start the coffee maker with her back to me. Sadie came down a minute later in her fox pajamas, rubbing one eye, and her whole face opened up when she saw me. "Grandpa Walt, are you eating with us?" "Just this morning," I told her, and she climbed into the chair beside me, and the weight of her settling there, warm and trusting and completely unaware of what the day held, made something in my chest pull tight enough that I had to breathe through it carefully. Grant came down at 9, saw me at the table, and chose to say nothing about it. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Grant answered it and found Ed Palmer on the porch in a gray suit with a briefcase in hand, looking exactly like what he was, a lawyer who'd been doing this a long time and had stopped finding it uncomfortable somewhere around year 15. "Morning, Grant. Is Walter around?" Grant's face ran through about 4 expressions before he stepped back and let him in without a word. We sat in the living room, on the shelf where Marion's music box used to sit before it got broken, and Ed opened his briefcase. Hannah came out from the kitchen with a dish towel still in her hand, looked from Ed to me to the papers coming out of that briefcase, and her face went pale. "What is this?" Ed read the notice out loud, clear and unhurried. I was the sole owner of the property. As occupants without a lease, Hannah and Grant were being given proper notice under Ohio law 30 days, in writing, to arrange other housing. Hannah's voice, when it came, was shaking. "You can't do this. This is our home," Ed told her, evenly, that as licensees rather than tenants, they didn't carry the same protections, and that proper procedure had been followed in full. Hannah turned on Grant. "Say something. Do something." Grant looked at me for the first time in what felt like months, without Hannah's version of events standing between us, and what I saw on his face wasn't anger. It was a man who'd just had the floor drop out from under him. "Dad," he said, smaller than I'd heard him say anything in a long time. "What is this?" I looked at my son-in-law and told him plainly that this was my home, that he'd told the man who owned it to leave, and that I had chosen not to. He opened his mouth and closed it again. I got up, walked to the back door, and found Sadie standing in the hallway, drawn out by the noise, looking uncertain. "Hey, sweetheart," I said. "Come help me check on Grandma Marion's tomatoes." She took my hand without a second thought, and we went out to the backyard together while the locksmith worked on the front door. We stood among the tomato plants, and she asked me why some of them were still green and some were red, and I told her they all get there eventually, just not on anybody else's schedule but their own. They were gone by the 1st of the following month. I know the exact date because I stood at the front window and watched Grant's car pull out of the driveway loaded down with boxes for the last time, and what I felt wasn't relief and it wasn't satisfaction. It was grief clean. Uncomplicated grief for the version of all this that should have existed and didn't. The house went quiet in a way it hadn't been in over a year. I cleaned out Sadie's room the next morning and left everything exactly where it was. Her books, her crayons, the little plastic dinosaurs lined up on the windowsill in case she ever came back looking for them. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Hannah called. Her voice was flatter than I remembered it, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume. She told me, without much preamble, that Grant had told her the week before that he'd only really committed to the marriage because it seemed easier than the alternative, that he'd been unhappy for close to 2 years and never said so. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking on the word, "was I always like this? Or did something happen to me?" I told her I thought they'd both made choices that got them here, and that wasn't the same thing as saying it was all her fault. It just meant she had some say in where things went from where she was standing now. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she was sorry. For the things she'd said. For all of it. And something in my throat tightened in a way I hadn't expected it to. She came by on a Saturday morning in November, and we sat at the kitchen table with coffee the way we used to when she was younger. And it wasn't the same as it used to be, but it was something. She asked about the trust, whether it meant I didn't trust her anymore. I told her it wasn't about not trusting her, it was about not trusting the version of herself she'd been living as for the last year and a half, and that I hoped, genuinely, that would change. She asked if she could keep coming back. I told her the door had never been closed. It just hadn't been open the way it should have been for a while, and that was on both of us to fix now. December came in gray and cold, the way it always does in Ohio, settling into the bones of old houses like it means to stay a while. I was out back one Saturday afternoon wrapping burlap around Marion's rosebush by the fence when I heard footsteps coming fast up the garden path. I turned around, and Sadie was running toward me in a yellow raincoat 2 sizes too big, her sneakers soaked through, her face red from the cold and wet from something that wasn't rain. She crashed into me and wrapped both arms around my waist and buried her face against my jacket, and she was crying, not the practiced kind of tears, the real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere a child's been holding it for too long. I got down on both knees on the wet ground and held on to her. "Mommy said I have to be mad at you," she said, the words coming out broken up between sobs. "But I'm not, Grandpa Walt. I'm not mad. I don't want to be." My eyes burned so fiercely I had to shut them for a second. I held her tighter and told her I wasn't mad at her either, not for one single second, not ever. She pulled back and looked up at me with her face soaked through, searching the way kids search for the truth when they've learned they don't always get it, and something in her settled when she found it. She leaned back into me and let out a long, shuddering breath, and I held my granddaughter in the December cold in the garden Marion had planted, and I understood, finally and completely, what all of it had been for. Not the house, not the trust, not the lawyer or the 30 days. This moment, this child, the certainty that there was one place in the world where she would always be safe and always be wanted exactly as she was. I called Hannah once Sadie was dry and warm and sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa, told her she was here, she was safe, come whenever she was ready. Sadie looked up at me over the rim of that mug and asked, "Grandpa, can I come visit you all the time now?" I told her the door was open for her, always, no matter what. Looking back on everything that happened over those 9 or so months, I keep landing in the same place. I wasn't a perfect father, and I wasn't a perfect man. There were things I should have said to Hannah years before any of this started. Conversations I let slide because keeping the peace felt easier than telling the truth. If I had it to do over, I wouldn't wait as long as I did. I'd say the hard things sooner, with more love in them and less patience for the kind of silence that lets damage take root and grow. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until the walls are already coming down around you to decide what you're willing to stand up and protect. What 66 years and one very hard year in particular taught me is that dignity isn't something anybody else hands you. You either hold on to it yourself or you don't. And the moment you let go of it, not for pride, but for the sake of a child who's watching you do it, that's the moment everything starts to come apart. I believe in the quiet kind of justice, not the loud kind. The kind that shows up on a Saturday morning with a briefcase and a locksmith and 30 days written notice, and doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. This is what it looks like when a 66-year-old man has nothing left to prove to anybody except one 5-year-old girl who still believes a talking stegosaurus is out there somewhere, waiting to be found. If this story found something in you tonight, if you've lived something close to it or you love somebody who has, tell me about it down in the comments. Pass it along to somebody who needs to hear it tonight. And if you believe family deserves the truth even when the truth is hard, stay close to this channel, because there's another story coming, and I think you'll want to be here for it. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than you'd think. One last note before you go. Some details in tonight's story were shaped to protect real people, but the heart of it is as true as anything I know. If that's not the kind of story you came here for, no hard feelings at all. But if you're still with me, I'll see you next time.